Welcome to Western Civ 134, World War I, Part 3, 1916. I always refer to 1916 as the year of blood, because this is the year of the Battle of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Jutland, and then, of course, the American election of 1916. But this is the year where casualties really roll up, as the British try to take some pressure off of the French down at Verdun by trying to break through an area in the north that's very heavily defended. And of course, at Verdun, the Germans are attacking a position that they know the French are not going to give up, and they will throw everything they have, keep it, as a result of their defeat at the Battle of Sedan during the Franco-Prussian War. So technically, this battle is designed to bleed France white, to run their casualties up. Unfortunately for the Germans, it runs their casualties up as well. Here is Europe at the beginning of 1915, and here is Europe at the beginning of 1916. So you can see that during 1915, there wasn't much movement on the Western Front, if any, but the Eastern Front, the Russians were beaten up a little bit, and even Austria has been able to take a little land as well. When I teach World War I, students will frequently say, well, how much land is there really, are they fighting over? I found this map in one of my magazines from World War I, and it superimposes the entire front, the Western Front and the Eastern Front, over a map of the United States, so that you can see that the Western Front is about Denver, and then it goes over towards the Missouri side, down to Louisiana, up into northern Minnesota. It looks really big on a European map, but if you don't have a scale to compare it to, it's quite small in comparison to the United States, or if you put it on Russia or something like that. But just remember, there's probably 70 million soldiers rolling around in this territory during the war. Here are some of the main events of 1916, as I refer to it, the year of blood. The Battle of Verdun, which starts on February the 21st and runs until December the 18th, 1916. Then you have the great naval battle of World War I, the Battle of Jutland, May the 31st to June the 1st, 1916. Then you have the Arab Revolt in the Huzzahs, which begins on June the 6th, 1916. That'll be T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. British will get involved, the Ottomans and the Arabs. And then we have the Battle of the Somme, July the 1st till November the 18th, 1916. First day of the Battle of the Somme is one of the bloodiest in modern history. While all of that's going on, there's an American presidential election being held in which Woodrow Wilson will be reelected on November the 7th. However, you will be surprised at how close the margin was to him winning that election. Before we start the slaughter, let's look at trench warfare. Now here's a map of the Western Front trench warfare to Switzerland. Do not get the idea that there's one line of trenches on each side. There are depths of trenches on each side. You'll see where Verdun is. That's where the Battle of Verdun will take place. And you'll see up around Arras, that's where we're going to have the Battle of the Somme, and around Amiens. So there's the situation. Here we have a nice little drawing to show us what the trench lines look like. You see no man's land, the forward sap, which is a listening post. Then you have your trench lines, and you have the communication lines between trenches, and then you have the staggering, so that, if you have an explosion or a bomb that goes off and you have a line of trenches, if you don't break it up, that shrapnel will just go down getting everybody. So they have all sorts of these constructions to kind of make that a little safer for the troops, barbed wire and everything else. Then you have support trenches, then you have the company headquarters, there's reserve trenches, and this goes back and back and back. And this has to be worked on all the time. If you remember the pictures from the Battle of Ypres, after a battle, this is all blown the kingdom come. Then you got to dig it all back again. And remember, the Germans are up on high ground, which means when it rains, all of the water in their trenches is pumped out and it goes downhill into the Allied trenches. So you talk about a muddy mess. This gets to be a muddy mess. Now here's a line drawing showing the trenches. You've got your barbed wire, you got your front line, you have your traverse, firing bays, you have the latrine out front. You want to put the bathroom out front. That's going to make people want to go a lot. And then you see the dugouts where you would be staying. Of course, everybody's scared to death they're going to be buried alive, so they don't really stay in those very often. But yeah, this is the way it would be on both sides. So the Germans, being on the high ground, have a lot more concrete and reinforcing than the Allies do. If you're wondering what the latrine looks like, here's the improvised latrine from frontline troops. You have a box, and then inside of the latrine you put a kerosene tin with a wooden cover, and you put it down in the hole, and then you have your hinges on the top, and you do what you need to do, and then when it fills up, you can take it out and empty it. You just don't dig a trench somewhere and just keep going at that location. In theory, this is what it's supposed to look like. You have a fire step, so if you want to shoot, you need to step up, take aim, open fire. You have to be careful. You've got snipers everywhere. They're looking for anything to take a shot at you. You have what they call the parados, which is behind. So if a bomb goes off behind you, that shrapnel will be absorbed by that, hopefully. The parapet does the same thing in the front. Then you have the dugout, where you could be sleeping or you could be resting. But again, if it's raining, you notice that the dugout the entrance is lower than the bottom of the trench, so that would flood out pretty quickly. Now, there are people, this is a beautiful recreation of a perfect trench. It's what it looks like on the outside. It's what it looks like on the inside. But of course, as a sniper, all you need to do is keep an eye on the opening ports. Some people will actually have periscopes on their rifle so that you can look up using the periscope and take aim rather than shooting with your eyes to it. But there's a British individual who loves World War I so much, this is what he did to his backyard. He built his own trench and dugout and all sorts of other stuff. Now, I know the British love their gardens, but this is taking it one extra step. Now, reenacting World War I it's not fun. You're not riding around looking good like in a Napoleonic era. You're living in a trench area. I wonder if he has big rats that come by at night to nibble on his toes. You get up and you run across no man's land, and meanwhile you're going, in 15 minutes I'll be dead. That's not exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for. And all of these would have been dug by hand, but towards the end of the war, in late 1918, the British came up with this great trenching device. Works really well, but it's a little late at that particular time. And then here are the problems. If you're a soldier and you've been given the go-ahead to attack, so you have to get out of your trench. Then you have to cross no man's land, which is this torn up mess of territory. It's only flat and smooth on the first day of the battle. After that, it's just churned up. Then you have to fight through your barbed wire, which is meters deep, and all sorts of obstacles. Then you get to the front line trenches, which are frequently protected. Some of them, the Allies do this too, but the Germans like to put a barbed wire net over the top of them. So even if you get there, you're like stuck on a spider web. And then you've got machine guns, you've got support trenches, you've got concrete blockhouses for machine guns. They got heavy artillery back behind. It's in depth, so you take one and then you hope you can hold it. And then you take the next and you hope you can hold it. And towards the end of the war, they can start bombing you with planes. But prior to that, the aircraft are for the most part just to spy out when people are planning to attack you. Here's some examples of Allied trenches. Now here's the real fancy one. We've got the covering over the top with some barbed wire. We've got the reinforcing there to hold the dirt in place. But then here we have one that's not unusual. You simply pile sandbag on sandbags and maneuver them around as you need. Notice that the sandbag trenches is basically a straight line. Then here we have some men in a dugout. One of the great fears of World War I is being buried alive. So it really does drive them a little nuts sometimes. Here's another sepia tone version. They don't dig theirs in quite as deep. Probably is a location they've just taken and haven't been able to finish it up. Here we have troops getting ready to go over the top. They're in position to head out and start across the no man's land. Here we are in the Alps. If you're down in Caporetto, where you're fighting the Austro-Hungarians, you're in the Alps, so digging trenches are a little difficult. There's another problem with fighting in the mountains. Frequently, the opponents will fire artillery shells over the top of you into the mountain behind you to start a landslide. The other thing is, particularly in the Caporetto area, you have a lot of granite, and the shell will explode, and you'll get hundreds of pieces of shrapnel from the granite. The biggest problem in the early part of World War I is what you see here, and that is water. It rained a lot in 1914 and 1915. The French farmers claimed that all the artillery loosened the skies. There's an interesting fact in that a lot of the artillery used nitrates in the explosive, so they may have been seeding the clouds. Obviously, this is a major problem. The other issue that you have is when you go to cross no man's land, you have all of these shell holes filled with water, and you don't know whether they're a few inches deep, feet deep. And in the northern part of the Western Front, that is yellow mud. It's sucking mud. There are people who are drown in that it's like quagmires. You have to really be careful. Of course, the upside is when it's raining, it's really almost almost impossible to attack one another, but you can shell each other. They're going to do something every day. There's a cartoon from the English side, the new submarine danger. They'll be torpedoing us if we stay here much longer, which gives you an indication of just how much rain they were receiving. The area between the two sides, trenches, of course, is known as no man's land. Here's an aerial view showing the trenches and showing the gap between the two sides. And that can be hundreds of yards, but this is what it looks like if you're going to have to cross it. So here's one section where it used to be a forest, and it's been completely blown down. Looks pretty even, but again, it's a mess to try to cross through that. Here we have another view. This is as if you were getting out of the trench. Actually, this is a stereoscope picture. I have a stereoscope which makes it 3D, and it's really eerie because you can see arms and legs out in there. There's an exploded tank, so they go, okay, we're going to cross no man's land. That's what you're talking about. And then here's one where you can see the fortifications up ahead, a fort or a strong point, and you're going to have to get through this in order to get up and over. Now, every night, each side usually sends out scouting groups to wander around through there to see how far they can get and test the other side out. Trying to get across this is a nightmare. Here's some examples of German trenches. Here we have one with, like the Allies, they had barbed wire over the top of it, an unsuccessful Allied soldier, kind of a closer view of how that covering works. And then here you see the sandbag dirt fortifications, and here we have the German soldiers putting the protection to keep the dirt in place. And then here is the ultimate. This is a concrete reinforced steel revetment, and they do have a lot of these, particularly in the area where the Somme is located, because it had been pretty inactive early part of the war. Some of those places are electrically lit. They have mess halls, that they have quarters to sleep in, so it is much more sophisticated. And then here's an example of what's known as the German high ground. They're the machine gunners up on the ridge shooting down at the Allies, who not only have to cross no man's land, they have to go uphill to attack the German trenches. The Allies are always amazed when they get to the German trenches. They love to loot them because they have great tinned food that they can take and cook. Miscellaneous trench issues. Well, there's rats. There are rats everywhere, and they're big. They weigh pounds. And the reason for that is very simple. They have a literally unlimited supply of raw flesh to eat from the people being killed out in no man's land. And they roamed the trenches and they tried everything. They trained dogs. They did all sorts of stuff. They still had rats. Quite frankly, I'm surprised there wasn't a bubonic plague outbreak, but that did not happen. There's also an issue with some disease. Now here you see some soldiers, some Allied soldiers, having their feet inspected. They're looking for trench foot, which is kind of a bacterial issue from having your feet in wet and damp climates and stuff. That can be cured with iodine, mercurochrome. There's also a trench mouth that causes your gums to turn black, and you can lose your teeth with that one. And then they all have cooties. That's lice. Both sides have lice, and they're called cooties during World War I. And periodically, they will spell the troops out and send them out for a steam bath and whatever, and they go back to the trenches and they get lice again. And of course, lice are responsible for spreading typhus. But again, we don't have an outbreak of that, so we're very fortunate. Unfortunately, there will be an outbreak of Spanish flu in 1918, but that's later. And of course, boredom sets in. There's what is known as trench art, where they take pieces of artillery and they make all sorts of things out of them. They also make brass knuckles, knives, and all sorts of things. And then various groups like to take pictures to show how grisly everything is. So here's one where we have all the soldiers that have been killed trying to take this trench, and they're covered in flies. And then this one is the most famous of the photographs along that line. It's a German soldier that has a skeleton head. It's obviously fake. There was a body without a head, and they found a skull without a body. So the photographer fit the two of them together. Now the French actually produce a weekly magazine where if you take your own pictures and they use it in the magazine, they pay you for it. And the more grisly, the better. The same is true with stereoscopes. The more grisly, the better it sells. So there is a little sickness involved in the war doing it that way. I would suggest that if you really want to see how bad it can get, there was an anti-war book published after the war. It's called A War Against War. There's a German individual who took pictures of before and after, and it was banned, and the books were confiscated. They have since reprinted it, but it is chilling, to say the least, what is in that book. So that's the trenches. It's time to get into the battle. So let's head to Verdun. The Battle of Verdun, February 21st to December the 18th, 1916. Now this is a battle that's basically an attempt to get the French to throw everything they have into this position, hopefully bleed them white and reduce their numbers. Now, there's an excellent article. It's called Nature Herself Murdered, which covers the story of Verdun. But of course, at the beginning of World War I, this is the area where the French believed that the Germans would attack, which is why there are all the forts there. And of course, the Germans came in from Belgium. And then when they're looking to possibly hurt the French even more, they picked this spot because this is sacred ground from the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. This is the site of the great defeat of the French army at Sedan. And you'll see the maps from the Franco-Prussian War as the Prussians come in and then begin to encircle the French army, which contains Napoleon III. Then they fully are completely surrounded, which forces Napoleon III to surrender, and then the Prussians then march and surround Paris and starve it out, ending the Franco-Prussian War, but beginning the unification of Germany as a state. Now, the battle was delayed for a few days because of a massive snowstorm, and that kept the French from being completely surprised. Now, they had been receiving from villagers and other people, and even had some captured Germans who were talking about this huge offensive that was coming. And it took a while to convince the French, and ultimately they began rushing troops into the region. And then the fighting started, and the artillery barrage was unmerciful. As a matter of fact, it was extremely effective, but it was too effective. When the German infantry was finally put into motion, a lot of the targets on their maps had been completely obliterated, and they couldn't tell where they were. And on this map you see, and I picked a nice German map, it was actually one of the best ones that I found. You see where the Germans started, and then you see the maximum area of advance by the Germans, and then eventually the French will push back. But there's Fort Douaumont, Fort Fleury, Fort Vaux, major fortresses. You see the main hills, Hill 265, Hill 295, Hill 304, which the French will try and hold as much as they can. So this becomes then a slugfest between the two sides. The fighting will literally rearrange the topography in this area. So here's some views of the battlefield. And there were forests in here at one time. Now you have roads through them. And they have some colorized pictures of the French defending troops in their trenches as they're trying to make their way across this lunar landscape. You know, another thing about the heavy artillery was the ground was so chewed up that the Germans could not move their heaviest artillery forward where they wanted them to. They had to use their medium artillery and light artillery later on. And then they continue advancing, firing literally millions of rounds of artillery. There's the map showing the advance. The big attempt at the breakthrough was at Fort Douaumont in that central area. They could get completely through there. They could then go right on the Verdun and split the French army and the defending army in half. Here's a picture showing piles of empty shell casings. And of course the French are bringing in every reserve they can find. And here's some pictures of what is called the Sacred Way, the one main way in where they're bringing in the reinforcements and troops from all over France. And here's one of the surviving trucks, a Bechtel vehicle. The heart of the French defenses were these massive fortifications. Here's a map showing what is called the heart of the battle. And it shows, of course, today the ossuary and the main cemetery, but it shows Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux, and some of the other forts. Now here is a drawing of Fort Vaux. And this is all concrete, reinforced steel, 10 feet, 15 feet thick. And they have artillery, machine guns. They can store their troops in there. They're incredibly difficult. Here is a view of the fort after the fighting. Look at the overlapping shell hole over overlapping shell hole, and you see the little road, which is where reinforcements ultimately come in. Of course, it does fall, but then later on, and it's retaken. That's where they come in. This is an aerial view of the site today, 100 years after the fighting. And then this is a close-up of the rooftop. And you see those round areas. Those are pop-up 155 millimeter gun turrets. They also have pop-up machine guns. guns. And then they'll also have observation ports that can pop up and down. So each of these forts have this particular type of defensive structure, and they have a good view of the area coming in. They also have communication. Communications obviously is the first thing that goes. The telegraph goes down. If they have telephones, the telephones are down. So they use pigeon. And this is one of the pigeons that was the last one that they sent out with the message that this fortress was about to fall. And they have him stuffed at that used to be in the Army Museum, but they've moved him back for the centennial, back to the main fort where he would have been stationed. And then here's the exterior of Fort Douaumont before the war. You can see how massive this fort is, but again, it's static. It's sitting in one place. You can just bomb away at it. There's the drawing of the interior, and then there's the view of the bombardment and the view of it today. Of course, those trees they weren't there during the fighting. They're long gone. And then there's, again, one of the machine gun ports, and then a view of the advancing German troops and the various lines directly ahead of them. And then here's the entrance. You can see how badly the entrance is chewed up when you come in the park and then walk into it. But when you walk into it, it's not too bad of condition. You have defensive positions such as this corridor where you have staggered defenses. You can shoot and fire and then retreat back to the next one and fire and then work that way. And then here's this whole area underground. We have ammunition, food, barracks, hospitals. They have artillery pieces in there. You have your machine guns. So they're very, very formidable. And once you get in, it's not an easy task because as you can see, even on the inside, they're relatively undamaged on the interior. And then, of course, Verdun today, I mean, the pictures that you're seeing here were from the 75th anniversary, and you still see a farmhouse and then trench lines, defensive fortifications with shell holes, and a portion of the farm fields and the woods that is still overlapping shell hole over overlapping shell hole. So it just mangled the whole site. Now it gets ugly. The Verdun casualties from February the 21st to December the 18th. The French lost 542,000 killed in action, missing in action. The Germans lose 434,000 killed in action, missing in action. Now, that does not include wounded. I've seen people where they will say that this includes the wounded. It does not. These are the people who were killed on the battlefield and those they never found on the battlefield. Now, we've talked about other battles and we've had numbers before, but not numbers like this. 542,000 is the equivalent of everyone killed in the American Civil War, not counting wounded. You put the two numbers together, it's almost all American soldiers killed from the American Revolution through Vietnam. Can you imagine what that would do to a country to have that many people? And this is just one battle. And we've had it since 1914 and 1915. And then we have this. This is such a big deal to the French, not the casualties, but the battle, the importance of it, that there is no more valued object than a wound badge from Verdun, showing that you served at Verdun and were wounded, or even that you served at Verdun. But what do we do with all of these bodies?
After finishing Verdun, I thought it was appropriate to talk about what happens to the people who are at home who lose a member of their family. Now, one of the things that museums are really good at is they're very good at showing artifacts. They're not very good at showing the pain, the feelings of the people. And usually when I take groups to the Liberty Memorial, we go downstairs into the library and I acquaint them with items that are associated with the personal part of the war, something that doesn't show up very well on a video or a documentary. Now, every country has their own method in World War I of notifying families, and every country has a different variation of what those families keep. Generally speaking, it's a telegram of some sort. Those almost never survive. They're usually thrown away or kept until members of the family, the parents, are gone, and then they're destroyed or taken with them. In Germany, the tendency was to produce what is known as a death card, and they will use this in World War II as well. You have a picture of the individual who's been killed. It lists when he was born, where he died, battle, campaign, and then the backside is usually a little religious theme. Now in World War II, the only difference in this is you're going to have Nazi emblems on the back in Thor more than you're going to find Christian emblems, if you will. And just as when I talked about coins, you'll see these a lot closer as we go along. But this is one individual from Germany. Now in Great Britain, now none of the soldiers who were killed in France, even the Germans, their bodies were not taken home. They were buried on site or cremated or whatever. So families never got a closure or a body to bury. But the English did. This is a gentleman, and by the way, I bought most of these at garage sales, with the exception of this one. This one I bought off of eBay. This is a note card that came with a medal. And the note card says, "I join my grateful people in sending you this memorial of a brave life given for others in the Great War. King George." Because this gentleman had been a member of one of his guard units. But even King George loses so many people that this is nothing more than a printed card that is sent out en masse. But the English did endeavor to produce a bronze plaque for every family that lost someone. And what most people did with this is they took and went to a cemetery or their family cemetery and put what is known as a cenotaph. They put a fake gravestone, and they would affix this to that gravestone. If you've ever read All's Quiet on the Western Front, Henri Remarque wrote a whole series of books that went all the way to World War II. In the second book, which is called The Black Obelisk, a German veteran of World War I sells tombstones to families so that they can have a memorial in their graveyard. So this has the man's name on it, and it's blank on the back. Now, if you ever want to buy one of these, most families won't part with it. But some people will sell them, and some people will do something else. These are bronze. So starting in 1970s, people began going to World War I cemeteries with crowbars and popping these off to melt them down. Then they began selling them on eBay and other places. So if you're going to buy one from eBay, you need to do what I did. Ask for a picture of the back of the plaque. It has no marks. It has no scars. It has a little spot right here. When I contacted the gentleman who was selling it, he said that his grandparents had basically soldered this to the fireplace. And they were moving out of the house and nobody wanted it, so they thought somebody else might like it. So this is Mr. John Dunbar's. Just something to be careful with. In the United States, nothing special was done. You had to make your own. And in that case, I have what a lot of people did is they simply had a printed card that you just filled in. This one is really poignant. I point this out to my class. It's printed. Private Delbert L. Garner died November the 19th, 1918. The war ended on November the 11th, but he's not killed in France. He's part of the 6,000 American troops sent to Russia to fight in the War of the Reds and the Whites. He's killed at Murmansk. If you can find a soldier's name, you can look up their record online. So this was something that happened. But again, most people, in the case of my uncle who was killed in World War II, they put on the tombstone a picture of him in between his parents so that he would kind of be with them. Now, in the United States, we have, I still do, what is called the Gold Star Society. So if this man had been registered in the Gold Star Society, this is what the people would have received. They would have received this gold envelope, an acknowledgement, and on the inside of it, it would tell you where he was buried and a variety of other things. And then you would also have received this star. Now, I'll talk about this after we do the Battle of the Somme, And when I have some other things that I want to show you, but normally people would have a little pendant in the window with a blue star on it. And if someone was killed, then you would replace it with a gold star, and that told your neighbors that you'd lost a member of your family. Now, this is not from World War I, but they used this in World War I. This is from World War II. This is Mr. Harry Nelson's. I always like to say their names so that they're just not forgotten. The way I came across this was very unusual. One of our teachers at the high school lived in the Waldo area of Kansas City, and an elderly woman had lived next door to her for many years. And when she came back from vacation, the house was being emptied out. She had passed away and the house had been sold, and they were just throwing stuff away. And she went out with this pile of pictures and papers and asked the people if she could look through it. She found all of this material in a box and then gave it to me, and I've used it in class. We've always used it in class because we try to, when you teach history, you talk about wars, politics, social issues, all sorts of things. But this type of material is very precious in that it is powerful. You can feel the pain. And then one last thing. In the United States, and I'm sure they did it in Britain, and you may not see this very well, but I'll have a better picture for you in a little bit. This is a postcard. It's a photograph that was taken of a group of men from the same area as they went to war. And they're all autographed. They're all marked. And what was customary, you took a buddy picture when you went off to war. And then when you were done, you took another buddy picture. Generally speaking, if everybody survived, this was easy to do. If they didn't, then you went to the cemetery where your lost buddies were buried. In this case, only one of those gentlemen survived the war, but they were engineers, first in, last out. And so this is the type of thing that people deal with loss. And when you look at those numbers that I've been talking about, referring to 1916 as a year of blood, you're not getting 10 or 15 or 20 or 100. You're getting thousands. Villages were getting thousands. In Newfoundland, one whole area, they recruited a 1,000-man regiment. 987 of them were killed in the first 15 minutes of the Battle of the Somme. How do you withstand that? And that's the piece that's missing. You can't feel that in a museum. You can look at the equipment, you can look at the uniforms, go, wow, that's really tough. And if you've never been in the military, it's even harder to understand why the bond between people who are fighting together to save each other's lives as well as to gain an objective and protect a country, why they have such a close relationship. But anyway, I'll talk about the home front a little bit later.
One of the problems in World War I is, how do you collect the dead? You're killed in no man's land. Frequently, it was impossible to go out and get them. They might just lay there until they decompose. When you have a battle that runs as long as Verdun does, you're going to have bodies that are blown up, pieces here, pieces there. So frequently, bodies are buried on site on the battlefield. Sometimes the bodies are collected and placed in cemeteries near the battlefield. But this is such a gigantic mess. Now, here is an example of one individual. A gentleman in 1919 put up an ossuary. This is a bone yard. They put this building up and they collected bones from this particular area, and then later on they added some pieces of equipment around it so that people could come and pay their respects. And you notice you have basically that's the Virgin Mary telling everybody to be quiet. But the problem is this. This is a picture of piles of bones from the battle in one section of the battle. It's not a Holocaust picture. It's a picture from Verdun. So inevitably what the French ended up doing, particularly as a result of the Bishop of Verdun's activity, is they built a giant ossuary, a giant boneyard, along with a cemetery. Here is a picture showing the Fort Douaumont ossuary and the bodies being taken from local graves being moved to the cemetery. There's a 16,000 space cemetery. estuary in front of the ossuary. This is an aerial view of it, 1932. And this is a ground level view of it today. And then when you go inside, it is eerie to say the least. Here is the chapel, and then here is a hallway. And this hallway has nooks for each of the areas of the battlefield. And in each of those sections, they have piled underneath them the bones from that particular section of the battlefield. You get all the way down to the end, they have this eternal flame with some more of those alcoves. In all, there are 18 alcoves. It's 137 meters long. The names on the walls are people that were never recovered. These are the missing in action. Believe that there's 134,000 soldiers that are buried in here. This is one of the alcoves, and then here's another one. There's 14 cubic meters of remains, and some of them have a glass port in which you can look down and see this, which is the skulls and the bones of the people collected, just piled in there. This is what happens at the end of one of these massive battles. It's not a wonder that people who served in World War I had nightmares and PTSD like we talk about today. In those days it was called battle fatigue. And have nightmares that you're dead, that you've been buried alive, and to see day in and day out your friend killed. You can't get to them. The bodies don't go home. It's terrible, and it's terrible for all sides. But this is Verdun. Well, let's leave the battlefield for a while and go out into the sea. Now, the naval war, for the most part in World War I, we usually just think about the U-boats, the submarines trying to sink any kind of Allied commerce, and the Allied ships trying to sink all the submarines they can find. But we do have several naval battles, and the largest naval battle is the Battle of Jutland. It took place on May the 31st and lasted until June the 1st, 1916. Here is the overall commander of the German Navy, Admiral Tripitz. What a uniform. What a beard. And here is what was going to happen. You see the red area, which is the minefield that protects the German high seas fleet. The Germans decided they were going to go out and try and lure one of the North Sea fleet pieces of the British Navy into a trap. So they sent out what is called a bait force. That's Admiral Hipper. He's in front. His job is to go out, be noticed and found by a British group, and then fire on them and then begin retreating. Hopefully luring that group closer, and ultimately we'll meet up with the rest of the fleet, and then they can jump on them and finish them off. What happens at Jutland is we have both sides use the same tactic. Beatty is the British bait force. So he finds Hipper, and then Beatty, instead of chasing Hipper, runs off. So Hipper chases Beatty, and of course runs into the rest of the fleet, led by Jellicoe, who then turns and heads back towards Germany and runs into SCHEER with the rest of the fleet. So in essence, both sides threw everything they had at each other. Now I want you to notice that one of the things about these naval battles, they're really hard to keep track of, and they're really hard to chart because they're turning and twisting and changing directions and crossing the T. That's where you're going straight, but your opponent is sideways, and he can bring all of his guns to bear on you, and it becomes very, very confusing. And this is a coal oil period, so lots of black smoke, no radar, no sonar. It's visual contact. You're firing by visual efforts, and your guns can fire a lot further than you can see. In addition, a lot of these capital ships, these big ships, have torpedo tubes on them as well, so they're going to be firing torpedoes at each other. Now the commanders, here's the German side. You have Admiral SCHEER, who is in charge of the main fleet, and Admiral Hipper, who is the bait force. And then we have the British commanders, which is Admiral Jellicoe and Admiral Beatty. Jellicoe is in charge of the main fleet. Beatty's in charge of the bait force. Beatty's married to an American socialite, so he has a little more stylish uniform. So that's the commanders, and we're going to let them go at each other for a while in the North Sea. Well, here's the tale of the numbers. The British have 151 ships. The Germans have 99. So let's look at them. Battleships. Britain, 28. Germans, 16. Now, these carry anywhere from 8 to 10 guns, 12 to 15 inches in caliber. But most of the German ones are all brand new, relatively new. The British, about half and half. They've got battle cruisers, 9 to 5. These are faster versions of the Dreadnought. They carry fewer guns and they have smaller guns, 11.5 to 13-inch caliber. They're also lightly armored, which which is not a good thing. Second line battleships, these are older ships. None for the British, 6 for the Germans. Armored cruisers, 8. Light cruisers, 26 and 11. Destroyer leaders, that's big destroyers, 5 to nothing. And then destroyers, 73 to 61. One mine layer for the British, one seaplane carrier, and neither side had submarines in the area. Although there were supposed to be about 45 submarines available, it's just that none of them were actually used. So now they're going to sail around and open fire on each other. Here's the HMS Dreadnought. This was the first Dreadnought class warship that the British built. And then this is the German equivalent, which is the Scharnhorst, one of the most powerful of the battleships that the Germans had. And here's another chart showing the movement of all of the ships during the fighting at the Battle of Jutland. And this is an interesting set of information. This is the amount of ordnance fired. Now let's look at the heavy shells. The British fired 1,239 15-inch shells, 42 14-inch shells, 13.5-inch shells they fired 1,533, and then 12-inch shells they fired 1,784. The Germans' biggest ship was just 12 inches, so that's 24, and then 1,173 for the 11-inch guns. So the Germans fired 3,000, about 3,600 rounds. The British fired 4,500 rounds. And then you get 120 hits for the British and 100 hits for the Germans. There are a lot of ships out there, and there were a lot of misses. So the British battleships took 29 hits, the Germans took 28. The British battle cruisers took 53 hits, and the Germans took 70. And the cruisers took 37 to 1, destroyers 1 to 1, and of course there were more destroyers than anything else. So the British received 120 hits from the Germans, and the Germans took 100 hits. And then the British fired 94 torpedoes and got 6 hits, and the Germans fired 105 torpedoes and got 3 hits. So there was a whole lot of missing going on. But still, there's some casualties that are going to come up. Here's an example of one of the German dreadnoughts. This is a picture taken before on the left-hand side during the battle, and this is the picture as she is limping back into port. She is just barely above water at this point. Then we have the Queen Mary. That's a nice picture of her before the battle, and there she goes up in smoke during the battle. This is the Invincible, another battleship for the British before the battle. Took a shot right into the central powder magazine, blew it up, and it broke in half. The losses, just in numbers, 14 ships. So lost 14 ships and 6,097 men. The Germans, they lost 11 ships, lost 2,551 men. Now, who won? Normally, you would say, well, who lost the most ships? Well, that's the British. Or you could say, who lost the most men? That's the British. But one of the problems is the Germans never came out again. The German fleet went back into their minefield and their harbor and never came out to fight for the rest of the war. So to some extent, although the British lost more ships, lost more men, they won the battle because the Germans never came out again. They were bottled up for the rest of the war, and then when the war ended, they had to turn their fleet over. So they end up scuttling it, sinking it for the most part. So it's really kind of a strange thing. Now, I will point out one thing. Towards the end of the war, the German Navy was ordered to go out and do battle. They refused to go. This was like last month or two of the war. They just weren't going to do that. So that's the result of the Battle of Jutland. The Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest day in modern history, July the 1st to November the 18th, 1916. On July the 24th, 1916, the British began a 7-day bombardment in which they fired 1,733,000 shells into the German defensive positions, expecting to soften them up. So we have piles of expended shell casings. And then here's the battle map showing the situation in July to November of 1916. So you have Verdun going on at the south, and you've got the Somme going on in the north. And as bad as Verdun is, the Somme is going to be just in that same category. At the end of the first day, the British lost 57,470 men. 19,000 plus were killed. The rest were missing in action and wounded. the highest casualty rate for any battle. It says any war for one day. Cannae for the Romans was higher. Others, I'm going to say in modern times. And one of the problems that you have with the casualties is a regiment had one doctor and X number of orderlies, and you would lose 1,000-man unit. That's all they had for medical treatment. And some people were wounded and waited 4 days to get help. You see in this picture, this actually shows people advancing out of the trench. The British were expected their soldiers to follow the officers who would get up out of the trench, and then you would walk at a fast pace because the intent was you wanted to make sure your whole line hit the enemy position at the same time. Well, you're crossing at the beginning, we don't have all the heavy shell holes from fighting the battle for 3 months. So it was relatively flat, but they're going to be going uphill. So here's a kind of a view from the German perspective of the British coming across this set of land. And then here's another view with the machine gunners on the top and the British down below. I mean, it was a slaughter. They had people being shot in the second line of trenches by Germans from their front lines, and they just kept coming. And so here you have some of the soldiers in dugouts, and here you have some soldiers in fighting their way through the woods. And then this section they've kept preserved. Now this is an old picture of it, but this is where the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, 1,000 men, where it went out and attacked the German front lines. And here's the result. They literally machine gunned them in rows on the field. Now, I saw a documentary done in the late 80s where they interviewed the last survivor of that unit. And one of the problems was it was known as a chum unit, which means they recruited men from 18 to 24 from the same geographical area in Newfoundland. So when this unit attacks, out of 1,000 men, only 17 survived the war. Actually, only 17 survived the battle. Those poor guys were wounded. The guy who was interviewed, he said, I got up, I took an X number of steps with my buddies, and then everything went black. And then a couple of days later, he wakes up in the hospital. And then when these men then went home, the community's devastated because that's the cream of the crop of the males in that territory. And some people took it out on the survivors. Why did you survive and my father didn't, or my brother didn't? You're not as good as this person. Of the survivors, more than half of them committed suicide over the years. And this gentleman said that he was Catholic and he didn't believe in that, and he has just suffered. And he would hope that sooner or later that he would be relieved of his suffering. It was just horrible. So the fighting is back and forth. And on the first day or two, the Germans were so shocked by the British actions that they got up and sat on the top of their French trenches, shooting at the British. It was just a slaughter. Eventually, they will try all sorts of things. They will try bringing tanks in for a little bit. They'll try sapping. Ultimately, they really won't make very much gain through the region, but it probably did relieve some of the pressure on the French down at Verdun. But it's just a debacle. There is a book that was published in the 30s. It's entitled Lions Led by Donkeys, and it's a absolutely scathing expose on the officers and the leadership of the British Army in World War I, and they're just total absence of how many men do we lose for this piece of property. This map shows the advances of the British during the Battle of the Somme. You see the solid yellow line is the British lines at the beginning of the battle, and next to it are the dotted line, which is the German lines at the beginning of the attack. That's the first wave. Then the second wave is the German lines are back a little bit in the 13th Corps, 20th Corps section, and by the evening there is a little bit more gain, but it's relatively insignificant. By July the 14th, there is a little bit of pushback, and ultimately, as the fighting goes on, the Germans do retreat back a little further and a little further until the solid line is where the Germans were at the end of the battle. But they still held the main ground in the region. Eventually, the British tried sapping, that is, tunneling under the German lines, place explosives, and then blow them up. Now, of course, there's counter-sapping, which is the Germans trying to find the other sapping positions so that they can stop them. So here is a colorized version of one of the big explosions, and then this shows the crater, and there's people at the top so you can get an idea how deep it was. And then here are several other surviving craters and what they look like today. today. There's the one with the red in the middle at the bottom. That one is usually every year we have relatives and soldiers that come by and put poppies down at the bottom. So there it is normally, and then the last picture shows people showing up for a ceremony to celebrate the people who were lost at this position. Unfortunately, when the war ended, there were still quite a few of these that had not been exploded, and it was determined that it was just safer to leave them in the ground and not try to remove the explosives. At least one of those has exploded since World War I as a result of a lightning strike, but only a few cows were injured. Well, here are the casualties of the Battle of the Somme. And remember, this is going on the same time Verdun is. The Germans have supposedly lost 650,000 killed in action, missing in action. And this number always seems a little bit strange since most of the time they're in defensive positions. There are times where they are counterattacking. It's usually considered to be a little bit high. The British, 418,000 killed in action, missing in action, and they rounded up to 57,000 to 60 on day one. And then the French, who came in and assisted the British, lose another 195,000 killed in action, missing in action. So if you take their numbers, that's 1,200,000 and some thousand people killed at the Battle of the Somme. And there's almost another, and missing. And they have about the same number at Verdun. So you can see why I refer to 1916 as the year of blood. The killed in the Battle of the Somme are laid to rest in 410 cemeteries in the area. That's just British units. Here's one picture showing an isolated unit. Here's an aerial view showing another unit. And one of the things that happens is, now it's 100 years now, and a lot of people believe that, okay, 100 years, the bodies have all disintegrated. Those cemeteries need to be removed. That's good farmland. Let's turn it back into farmland. Now, this created quite a stir when the French government came up with an idea that said that if no one comes by and places wreaths on these cemeteries within at least every 2 years, that it will be bulldozed and turned back into farmland. As a result, every year or every 2 years, British units come over to France to lay wreaths on these sites so that that does not happen. And of course, one of the things that is typical of World War I is the poppy. The poppy is the symbol of the dead soldier in World War I. And part of the reason these bloomed all over the place is because of all of this explosion and destruction stimulated the seeds and blew them all over the place. So you have these gigantic fields of these wild poppies that are growing, and so that's what it becomes the emblem. You know, even in the United States on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, you'll see the VFW with giving you a poppy and taking up a collection for veterans.
Well, we just finished the Battle of the Somme, and if you thought Verdun was bad, you really got an earful through this Battle of the Somme. So I'll do the last piece that I have of the home front. And this is how the people coped during the war. For example, when you have a volunteer army, you don't know that about how many people in your community have soldiers serving. When we had the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, we had a large contingent of troops, and so it was more prevalent. But when you start having in France, Britain, Germany, Russia, when you have millions upon millions of people in, the whole countryside, the whole town, all the villages, what do? Well, here in the United States, as we geared up and entered World War I in 1917, and then began shipping troops over in late 17, early 18, we had to deal with that too. And one of the most difficult things for people to do is, how do you strike up a conversation with someone? You know they have people who have been in the military. You bring the subject up and they go, oh, Johnny was killed last week. That's not exactly what you want to do. So one of the things that they did is they produced these mother's pins. These are Blue Star pins. The Blue Star, you would wear it on your clothing. It's very easy to see. And that would signify to people you met on the street that you had a member, or in this case, 2, or in this case, 3 members of your family. You could have had a husband and 2 children. You could have had 3 children. I've never seen one for more than 3, but I'm sure it's possible. You would see this, and then that would allow you to talk and give you conversation. Well, have you heard anything from them, and what, etc., and so on. If a member of your family died, then you would receive a gold star version of this. or in some cases, people would simply paint over the blue star with gold paint. So that was one. These are referred to as mother's pins. Okay? Now, if you have a girlfriend, she can participate too. This is a sweetheart's pin. This would be purchased by the soldier at the PX, which is the local place on the base where you can buy all sorts of goods and items. You could buy this and then give it to her as you're ready to go to the front, or give it to her after you've been married, or what have you. Unfortunately, the girlfriend would not get a gold star. I would assume if something happened to her boyfriend, she could have it colored, but these are unusual to find as well. Thing about items that are designed for mothers in particular, they don't want to see it disappear. It's a piece of them. And many times families are requested that that material either be buried with them or destroyed. So it's really hard to find this. And sometimes I'm disturbed when I do go someplace and I find people selling their memories. And they go, oh, it didn't happen. It wasn't worth anything. We're just going to get rid of it. It's like, oh, you're just going to let your relative disappear. And then there's this odd thing that you see all the time. That's very popular in World War II. It's a little pillow. That's what everybody thinks it is. Some of them actually are. This is a mother's pillow. To my mother. And again, like the sweetheart emblem, you would buy this and give it to your mother. It says mother on the one side and U.S. Army on the back side. I assume there's a U.S. Navy at some point. But what these are letter holders. You have a little poem, and then you have this spot here where the people could keep their letters. So mothers would keep their letters in these. Now this is really unusual because I want you to notice that it's discolored. It's discolored because this woman slept on it. And so her hair wore off this part of it. Now I have no idea. When I purchased this did not come from an individual. It came from an antique store. They knew nothing about it. It didn't come with any other material. So that's a little something that you could do. World War II, they did similar things. Now, I don't know whether you've noticed it or not, but on my finger is the rarest of all items that you can find. This, unfortunately, is a mother's death ring. This is not found all over the United States. It's particularly found here in the Midwest. And this happens to be my uncle who was killed in World War II. I've never seen one from World War I. And what you could do is, every soldier who graduated from boot camp, became part of the regular military, they took a graduation picture in their full military uniform. And they would take that picture down to the undertakers or several other places, photography places, and they would then have that picture photographed and then put on a simple little plastic ring. And then, unlike a gold star, this really shows up. And it, of course, shows the kind of pain that takes place. We were very fortunate, at least I was very fortunate. My mother was the youngest daughter, and Uncle Clarence, depicted here, was the youngest son. And Clarence, when he was killed, all of his material my mother took possession of after her mother passed away. There's also another little sidelight to the story, even though it's World War II, but it shows you how unusual things take place. My dad was a vice president of advertising of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad during World War II at the beginning of the war. And when they nationalized the railroads, they told the executives to go to a specific enlistment place, enlist, and they would make them officers. They would want to run the railroads, what they were doing. Well, it was Chicago. My dad liked the drink. He got drunk and went to the wrong one. They put him in the real army. They put him in the 2nd Infantry Division, and he had to take basic training with them before they could fix it. Uncle Clarence was my dad's sergeant, and my dad was the corporal, the company clerk. And he is the only member of that unit that survived the breakout at D-Day at the Battle of Saint-Lô. And my dad then went and visited all the members of his unit that he could find, and that's where he met Clarence's sister, my mother, And so that's how they came to be connected. And we've had many members of the family who think that another member should have it. That's not going anywhere. It's staying here with me. But that's a mother's death ring. So as I used to do when I taught high school, when I got to World War II, I asked the students to talk to their relatives about their experiences. If you have relatives, it's the World War II people are almost gone. But talk to your relatives about their experiences. They will tell you things that you can't find in a history book from a different perspective. Well, I hate to say I hope you enjoyed that, but I hope you understand the difficulty that people go through when you're fighting a war. It's not all rah, we do this. So I'll stop at this point and we'll continue with 1916.
Well, the fighting in Europe is going on the battlefield. In 1916, the battle is in the political realm because we have a presidential election. Woodrow Wilson versus Mr. Hughes, the Republican. Wilson is unpopular as a peace candidate, but he still draws a lot of support. He kept us out of war is his slogan. But this is the election, and look at how close it is. The electoral vote, 277 to 254. You need 272 to win. And in the popular vote, Wilson got 49%, Hughes got 46%, and then there was a 5% third party out of 18,528,743 voters. And you see where it fell along the lines there. Those that voted Democratic in the blue, those that voted Republican in the red. And so Woodrow Wilson will be president for 4 more years. Now, I don't know whether the Europeans consider that a good thing because they've been trying to get the United States into the war desperately. Well, let's see how the situation changed. Here we are at the end of 1915, and here we are at the end of 1916. So we have some gains against Russia, and there's some small gains in France, but for the most part, other than Russia, the Western Front is still frozen in place. But both sides are now getting desperate. Moving into 1917, Germany is being exhausted by a two-front war. She needs to get Russia out of the war as soon as possible. The French, they're starting to get lower in the draft. British are starting to get lower in the draft, and the British are starting to suffer from renewed submarine attacks. So they need to get the United States into the war in some manner. Wilson has been a tough nut to convince, but the Germans will probably end up bringing him in anyway, because they're going to make a calculation in 1917, and that is, even if the United States enters the war in 1917, it will be too late.